Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and I'm Gary Michuta, your host and sensei for this hour. Actually, I'm only going to be a part-time sensei because our guest, he's going to be stepping into the ring. And for those who are new listeners, you know, Hands-On Apologetics is all about explaining, defending the faith, learning how to do it with clarity, charity, and confidence. And this is we use many different disciplines, many different workout techniques, if you will, to train ourselves to be able to be great witnesses for Christ, to be used as worthy instruments of Him to reach out to others. And that includes, you know, we talk about papacy, we talk about philosophical arguments, we talk about conversion stories, because you can learn an awful lot about the Catholic faith from the eyes of those who enter from outside of it. And today we have a very special guest. We have the Cordial Catholic himself, K. Albert Little from Cordial Catholic Podcast. He's going to share his journey of faith into Catholicism from evangelicalism. He's going to be coming up on the other side of the break. And I can't wait to hear his story. As you know, it's a very popular podcast and has great guests too. I've been listening to it for a little while, and I gotta say it's great content. And he's a great host, and I think we're going to learn a lot by his story about becoming Catholic. Also, every episode we look at a logical fallacy, because critical thinking skills are so important, folks, especially today. There's just so much bad thinking. There's so many logical fallacies being used, propaganda techniques. You really need to be sharp to be able to discern truth from fiction, falsity from authentic information. And to help us do that, every episode we look at an informal fallacy in our Finding the Fallacy segment. Today's Finding the Fallacy, by the way, is the Fallacy of Division. And no, it has nothing to do with mathematics. It's a logical fallacy. We also meet one early church father every episode. So if you're a regular listener to the show, you're going to be familiar with an awful lot of the earliest Christians, and those especially that are important, that have left writings for us that help us show what exactly was the content of the Christian church in its earliest years. And today we have an early one. It is St. Clement of Alexandria. So got our plates full for today's show. And by the way, I should probably mention, coming up this week, of course, today we have Keith Little. Tomorrow we have our good friend Ken Hensley coming on. He's going to continue a series on Sola Scriptura. Our good friend Eric Ibarra Wednesday. Thursday, Carlo Broussard comes into the dojo, and then we finish out the week with Master Apologist Pat Flynn. Of course, he's a convert from atheism, just a wealth of information. All of them are, and we're really pleased to have them in the dojo with us. So let's see. By the way, many of us are stationed in place, so I'm glad to say that I know a lot of you are doing apologetics in place, and you're using social media to reach out to people and help clarify a lot of these misunderstandings about the faith. I want to salute you for doing so. And for if you haven't even thought about it, please, people, use social media. Tell people about the program. If you haven't subscribed, we have a YouTube channel for Hands-On Apologetics. Please subscribe. Tell people about it. Give us thumbs up. Do all those social media type thingies that you do. We really appreciate it. Not only does that help pass on this great information that we have, but it also helps our ministry at Virgin Most Powerful Radio, so we really appreciate it as well. If you have any questions for Mr. Little, the Cordial Catholic, you can give us a call toll-free at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. You, by the way, can also email us at Hands on Apologetics, and the email address to the dojo is questions@handsonapologetics.com. Very easy email address to remember, and we appreciate it. I do answer all the emails, by the way. Not always timely, I admit it, but we do answer our emails. Let's jump to the finding the fallacy for today, which is the fallacy of division. And this fallacy is an error in logic that occurs when one reasons from something that is true for a whole must also be true for all or some of its parts. Okay, now here's an example. Second grade in Jefferson Elementary eats a lot of ice cream. John is a member of the second grade at Jefferson Elementary, therefore he must eat a lot of ice cream. Now, of course, that's a fallacious way of arguing, because although it may be true as the group, it doesn't necessarily translate into the group as a whole. Who knows? Maybe John's lactose intolerant. Maybe he just doesn't like ice cream. And we foster and adopted 3 kids, and the weird thing is, some of them don't like ice cream or cake. And I don't know. That just blew my mind. I thought it was a prerequisite for all children to love it. So I suppose I was committing the fallacy of division. So that's our finding the fallacy for today. Actually, a very quick one, and one that's commonly used. It's just a matter of sloppy thinking. It's the fallacy of division. So never just suppose that because something is true of a whole, that it must be true of all its constituent parts. Okay, without further ado, why don't we jump to the Meet the Early Church Father for today, who is St. Clement of Alexandria, who was born sometime around AD 150, died perhaps 211, 216. And St. Clement of Alexandria was born of pagan parents, probably in Athens, about the year 150 AD. After becoming Christian, he journeyed to Italy, Syria, Palestine, seeking Christian teachers for his own instruction. Finally, he met the celebrated Pantaenus in Alexandria and was so attracted to the master that he settled there and became, in order, Pantaenus' pupil, associate, assistant, and then finally he succeeded Pantaenus as the director of the School of Catechumens, attaining the latter position roughly around 200 AD. 2 or 3 years later, he was forced by persecution under Septimius Severus to flee from Egypt. He died in Cappadocia between the years 211 to 216 AD without ever having seen Egypt again. And for apologetics, there are 3 major works that he used. And by the way, one thing you need to know about Clement of Alexandria and apologetics, what he wanted to do was take all of learning, pagan, profane learning, Christian learning, Old Testament wisdom, and synthesize it to show that it all comes into unity and is strengthened and affirmed by Christ the Logos. So don't be surprised if you have references from St. Clement of Alexandria from a whole bunch of sources, from Homer to Enoch to the Old Testament to New Testament stuff. He uses a lot, and he tries to bring this huge amount of learning that he has accumulated, bring it to bear on the Christian gospel. So just, that's a FYI for you. He and maybe Epistle Barnabas does the same thing, that they tend to glean from a lot of non-Christian sources and use them authoritatively. Okay, so what are those 3 writings I mentioned? Well, there's the Exhortation to the Greeks, which is written before 200. His Instruction of Children, also known as Pedagogos in Greek, that's about 202 AD. And the Stromantes, or the Miscellaneous, was written after 202. So those are his 3 major works. And as always for this segment, we use Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers. And Jurgens says the Exhortation of the Greeks is first of those three great works. It dates before 200. It is closely related to early Christian apologies, but still Clement has found a new approach. He no longer finds it necessary to rescue Christianity from the outslots and slanders and calumnies, but rather he is deeply concerned about the educative function of the Logos, the divine word, throughout the history of mankind. This being his concern, his work bears some claims of being a theology of history. His second work, The Instructor of Children, or Pedagogos, was a kind of sequel to it, written, like I said, around the year 202. It continues the development of the idea of the educative function of the Logos, who is presented as an instructor or tutor of converts in the conduct of their lives. The second and third book of Pedagogos turn to the problems of homely affairs of Christians in pagan societies, and is extremely formative work in which Clement appears to be a 3rd century Emily Post. Now again, that's not my words, that is William Jurgens' words. The last one is called Miscellaneous, or Stromatis in Greek. Let's see. This one lives up to his name. It's basically a whole collection of ideas that haven't been expressed or it hasn't been fully developed in the first two books. The Stromatis is an interesting one, Jurgens says. It is the word is suggestive of tablecloths, bedcloths, horse blankets, throw rugs in the means. In other words, it's a patchwork, okay, of things stitched together. And is the last named concept that the Greeks applied to this little book, which he had written. It is also indicates a kind of mishmash. One thinks of Abraham of St. Clair's works. It's kind of like a catch-all topic, and it's treated in 8 books, by the way. All right, coming up next, we're going to be talking to the cordial Catholic himself, K. Albert Little. Stay tuned, folks. More to come on the other side of the break. Listen to Hands on Apologetics.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning and love is the end. And God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Mary Ann Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands on Apologetics. And conversions to the Catholic faith is fascinating because we learned, how the faith looks to non-Catholics, what truths jumped out to them, what important features of our beliefs that us Catholics we take for granted every day, are really important and show the power of the fullness of Christ in His church. And so we have with us K. Albert Little, who is the podcast master, I guess you could say, of a podcast very well known and popular, known as the Cordial Catholic. You could check it out at podcast.cordialcatholic.com. And I'm not going to give you much biographical, I almost said biological, much biographical material because I want him to do it. And Keith, welcome to Hands on Apologetics.
Well, thank you, Gary. Happy to be here. I hope you don't have too much of my biological information with you. That'd be a bit alarming.
Yeah. Sometimes the mouth works faster than the brain on this show.
Hey, I hear you. Most of the time for me.
Well, hey, I noticed in the background you have a bass. You're a bass player?
It's actually a banjo, but same number of strings.
Okay. Yeah, I just saw the top of the neck. Beautiful. So, Keith, give us a background. Where did you start off in? Were you you grew up in an evangelical home, or?
Well, I like to say that I grew up in a home, Gary, that was evangelical, that was Christian. It's everything except for Christ, which is kind of backwards. And by that I mean it was a very moral household. We had a high value on telling the truth and respecting our neighbors and treating people properly and that kind of thing. Just without the aspect of what was driving us, which would have been Jesus. We went to church occasionally. That was certainly kind of the foundation of our moral values that my parents taught me, but not really religious in any sense other than Easter sometimes and Christmas. I was actually about 14 years old or so. It was between, now I'm a Canadian, Gary, so we say between grade 9 and 10. Now, I always get mixed up talking to Americans because you guys have different names for your grades in high school, but it was the summer between my first and second year of high school. And I was at a friend's house. We're having a campfire. It was kind of the beginning of summer. And this friend of a friend, this older guy who seemed very mysterious, had this aura of intrigue about him. We sat around this campfire, and this guy was talking about how everything in the world was connected and there was something bigger than just us. And it turns out he was a Wiccan. I had no idea at the time what that was or anything about that. But for the first time, interestingly enough, maybe this is embarrassing to tell you about, Gary, but for the first time in my life as a teenager, I'd occurred to me that there was something bigger than myself out there that maybe pulling the strings of the universe or what have you. And so I really began thinking about this idea of something bigger than myself. And of course, these were in the early days of the internet, and I went home and I typed into web crawler, Wicca, because this guy was a Wiccan. So I wanted to know what I could learn about his belief system. And of course, a million pages came up, and I couldn't discern any of these things because there was all these different branches and different practices of this, and it was all very esoteric. So, but my mind was opened up, ironically enough, through this Wiccan fellow to the idea that there's more in life than just myself and something bigger purpose. And so I remember I had this one friend, my best friend, in fact, was a Christian. And I knew this, evangelical. I knew this because he was busy on Sundays. So he couldn't hang out Sunday morning until about noon or 1 because he was busy at church. And so I went to him. With some questions. And this has always kind of informed my evangelization, because this guy, him and I never talked, Gary, about Christ, about the church, about anything, the Bible. But I knew from how he acted, from what he did, from the kind of peace I felt in his house as we hung out growing up. I mean, I knew him since I was 2 years old. So I'd been around his family a lot, and we hadn't talked about faith. But when it came time for me to ask these questions about faith, I went to him because he had something that I knew was appealing and answers that I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
skip ahead a little bit. I became an evangelical Christian. I said the prayer to accept Jesus into my heart. I bought a Bible, the Extreme Teen Bible. I bought the New King James Version. I had no idea about anything to do with the Bible. I began reading it in Genesis. Of course, by Numbers, I was burnt out, and I quit for a bit, and then I came back and realized, well, there's different testaments. You've heard the story before. I'm not the first one to do that. But I was an evangelical Christian, very much on fire, plugged into my church all the way up until university, and I got plugged into a student church there. Met my wife there, met all of our friends there. And it was at this student church, just finished my undergrad. I had an opportunity to work there for a little bit, to intern there. And the pastor there one day called me into his office, Gary, and said to me, he said, "Keith, what do you think is more important, the Bible or tradition?" And that just hit me as, I didn't have a framework for that kind of question at that time. I thought, well, I know in Sunday school, I know in everything I've ever read that the Bible or Jesus is usually the answer. That's the Sunday school answer. And this tradition thing, I wasn't raised, the Christianity that I've been experienced. And I went to a number of different churches, some Baptist churches, some non-denominational churches, some Pentecostal churches. None of these were necessarily anti-Catholic. But when I heard the word tradition, that word for me meant the Pharisees. It meant this ancient, stodgy kind of thing that we typically, as evangelical Christians, no matter what branch we were in, that's something that we were to avoid like the plague, right? And so when he's asking that question, I said, well, of course, it's the Bible. And he said, well, Keith, who or what put the Bible together? And I said, gee, I don't know. And that for me was kind of the first time that for me was the first kind of hole poked in my worldview, if you want to say that, in the dam, and the water began to trickle out, because it wasn't as if I hadn't read the Bible or studied the Bible. I had my first attempt at reading it back as a teenager and got stuck and had to restart. But I was deeply involved in reading the Bible. I loved my Bible. I knew my scripture very well. I'd read all these theologians. I'd read commentaries. I was into the Bible, but I had never thought about, and I know the books that you've written, Gary, in the areas of your study, this is deeply, in your wheelhouse. It hadn't occurred to me, though, who put the Bible together, or what framework was used to put it together. And as soon as I began to ask those questions, it pointed to some kind of authority outside the Bible that had to exist. And then, well, what might that be? Because the Bible didn't fall into the hands of Christians as I kind of maybe imagined it did when I would have had to think about it. It didn't fall into their hands from God in one piece. It had to be put together. These letters, these books were collected. It was discerned what belonged, what didn't. And that first question, Gary, that pastor asked me, really began this journey of discovering that answer, and then what comes with that. Right?
Why do you think the pastor asked you that question? That's a really odd question to ask a parishioner.
Well, it's a really interesting story. And it's a long story, but as it turns out, I'll make it short for you and the listeners, but as it turns out, he was raised Catholic, and he was working on his master's at an evangelical seminary, and he was asking these questions of his own past, looking to the church fathers and the early church, and kind of working on these things himself. And now I know a bit of – we remain in touch, this pastor and I. We are quite close friends there then. We're still fairly close friends. But it turns out I met somebody else who he was – so I was the third wheel in this conversation, Gary. And the other wheel was a guy he was also at seminary with. And he was also an evangelical pastor who ended up asking these same questions. He quit his ministry, became Catholic.
Wow.
And so I would meet that guy maybe about 5 or 6 years later. And we put the pieces together and realized the connection that we had was this one guy who was kind of asking both of us these same kind of questions, wrestling with. That other guy and myself both became Catholic. This pastor remains a Protestant pastor for now. Of course, we're praying for him.
Yeah.
But,
well,
it all
be a
dovetailed
backstory.
together one day.
Yeah, that's an unusual question to ask, unless he was already either he was challenged by somebody or he was already kind of digging into the same question. So, yeah, I knew there had to be some sort of backstory to that.
Yeah, and once you dig into that history, I mean, there's the famous quotation, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. I've put that backwards, but the idea is once I, and this is true for me and many converts like myself, once you begin to dig into the history of the church, and I was going on then from that question, looking at, I remember at one point I just Googled, I was just kind of exasperated, Gary, and I just Googled good books for Protestants considering the Catholic Church or something like that, and a bunch popped up. I read all of those books within a couple of weeks, maybe even less. Wow. But once I hit the early church fathers and began to put together the pieces of what questions the early church was asking to discern the biblical canon, and what the early church looked like and how they practiced and worshiped. I mean, like I said, I wasn't anti-Catholic. I wasn't necessarily deep in this like kind of mindset that tradition was bad or was evil. I had some inclination that it was not good to be just kind of steeped in these repeated prayers and these strange rituals. But once I began to read about the early church and discover that the way that Catholics worshipped was how the early church worshipped, not how I was worshiping as an evangelical Protestant, I mean, that just blew my mind. I didn't know. I had no idea. And I think the ship began to sail quite quickly after I began to read from these actual sources on what the early church looked like.
Yeah. So, how did you view did you even know about the early church fathers, before you were asked that question? Or if you did, like, what was your view of early Christianity?
Well, this too is classic. I mean, I am maybe the prototype or the archetype of many Catholic conversions, but I mean, I've literally seen this drawn out we used to have adult Sunday school classes at one of the churches I was connected to for a long time, these rigorous Bible studies and studies of church history. And we literally had a church history, early church course. But the early church, Gary, was Acts of the Apostles. That was where, there's this, the Bible is written, it's collected, and that's the end. And then there's this giant gap until the Reformation, when the church kind of starts up again, and then our history resumes, and there's these martyrs and these amazing teachers and reformers from the Reformation who we would hold in esteem. But my view of the early church was really the Acts of the Apostles, and then once Acts is over, there's the letters and the epistles, but there's no picture of the church outside of the New Testament. That's kind of where it begins and where it ends, and there's nothing more than that, right?
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. We're chatting with K. Albert Little about his journey into the Catholic faith. And stay tuned, folks. We're going to hear more about that journey on the other side of this.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
This This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics, and we're speaking with the Cordial, former evangelical turned Cordial Catholic, K. Albert Little. And, that's funny because you're right. It is the typical understanding of the early church is that the early church ended at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, and then you have this major lacuna until Martin Luther in the 1500s, and everything in between is kind of, terra incognito. We don't know exactly what it is.
Yeah, it's a very strange concept because, and then out of that, of course, Gary, flows this idea that the early church just was kind of these isolated little pockets that met in people's homes that had no kind of. Now, this is a little bit of. I mean, I don't know how this quite works out, and I had no problem with this for a long time, but I mean. The letters of St. Paul are very clear. There's clearly authoritative teaching happening. There's clearly people who have the authority to teach certain things, and you even see hierarchy establishing quite quickly in the early church. But you read this selectively, of course, and I did. I'm certainly guilty of that. But from this reading, the church that we saw, the early church that we saw from the New Testament was this kind of, this isolated pockets of Christians meeting in secret, breaking bread, and which we had no idea what that really meant, some kind of communion, right? Singing songs, preaching and teaching together. And so from there, our different denominations as evangelical Christians, even our non-denominational denominations that I was a part of for a long time, these seemed okay because the body of Christ was just different believers in different places in the world, kind of doing their own thing, but under the authority of the Bible and of Jesus. But of course, if you dig just a little bit further into the earliest early church fathers, you see quickly that there is this hierarchy and there are these churches being established and these people called bishops, and they're doing different things and they're teaching authoritatively, and it's not this kind of scattered church that has no hierarchy.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of an amorphous group. One quick question too is why non-denominationalism? Weren't there any other churches that you gravitated towards, or why did you settle there?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about life as an evangelical Christian is that denominations. I mean, there used to be this sense that the denomination, I think, was part of your identity. You're Presbyterian, you were Reformed, you were Baptist, you were Pentecostal. I think I was I guess you could say a convert to evangelical Christianity in a sense. I wasn't raised in any denomination. I was saved in high school. I became Christian, so I just went to the church where my friends were going, and that happened to be that was a Pentecostal church. We called it Baptist-costal because it was very much not a charismatic Pentecostal church. But I mean, denominations, I think, historically have played a role. But I think these days there's fewer people who would consider themselves to be a certain denomination. They just call themselves evangelical. And there's this tendency to kind of just go from church to church wherever wherever the in thing is happening. And for us, it just kind of turned out that we were in the student church together. I met my girlfriend, who's now my wife, at that student church. And once we were too old to be students anymore in the student church, we began going to the kind of the offshoot of that student church, which was a family church. And it actually was a Pentecostal church on the books, but didn't really fit in the Pentecostal framework, and was often kind of on the outs of that framework, and so eventually it became kind of non-denominational, just as it were, because it was too confined in the Pentecostal denomination, that framework. And so, I mean, for us though, it wasn't really as long as we could agree with the core statement of beliefs that church held to, which was often wouldn't have included the creed as we know as Catholics. It would have kind of been a creed light, a version of the creed that this church kind of discerned were the core values. So Jesus is Lord, the Trinity, these kind of things. As long as we agreed with that, the statement of that church, it was fine to go there and fine to move around if we felt like God was calling us somewhere else, or somewhere else had a ministry we wanted to get more plugged into, or was a better fit for our family. It really wasn't an issue of denomination, really.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So I can't wait to hear this. So as an evangelical, just cracking open the early church fathers, what was your first impression? And you already kind of named a few things that were influential with you. You want to expand a little bit on that?
Absolutely. Well, I remember I had Rod Bennett on my show, a fantastic Catholic apologist. I think you probably know him well. And he talked about when he first found this volume of the early church fathers in this bookstore, and it was this leather bound, and he had no idea it existed. And I was similar. And I joke with Rod on when I had him on my program that these days, so he spent a fortune, of course, on this collection of early church fathers. Well, I bought it for $2 on Amazon, the ebook format.
Nice.
And I was at first overwhelmed, excited, elated, confused, because I got I think it was 3,000 pages of the Ante-Nicene church fathers, all of these different early church fathers, these writers, these apologists, these bishops, these people. And I thought, what is this? How does this exist? And how did I not know about this? And I assumed, okay, if there was things we known about the early church, Gary, I assumed that it was maybe these small fragments of things scattered around and very hard to find and very ethereal or very mysterious. When I come across this 3,000 page volume, this giant ebook full of these different collected writers, I was flabbergasted. I thought, how did this exist? And I did not know about this. There's so much there. There's so many writings. And this was just the Ante-Nicene, so up before the Council of Nicaea. After that, there's even more writings. So, I mean, my first impression, to answer your question, Gary, was just, I think I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe that so much existed that explained what the early church looked like, what they believed, how they worshipped, the structure of the church, that I had no idea even existed in that form.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I bet it must have been, such a huge body of writings, and just to blip over it from Acts to 1500s. So as you're working through these things, actually, how did you work? Did you start at the beginning, kind of like with the Bible, and start with the Apostolic Fathers, or?
Yeah, I think I did. I began at the beginning of that, but the thing is, so quickly you recognize that the church that these early Christians are talking about really does not look like my evangelical church. Very quickly, you get into ideas of this thing called the Eucharist, which I thought, what is that? you get into these questions of authority, and I guess it shouldn't have shocked me in the way that it did, because this is something that Marcus Grodi on the Journey Home program often talks about, and I talked about this on his program when I was on there, and we've talked about this on my program when he was on mine, and this comes up again and again, these verses, right, that we don't see or read as Protestants that are in the Bible, because it shouldn't have shocked me, Gary, that these early church fathers were writing from a place of authority. And this guy, this Bishop of Rome, was writing to these churches saying, hey guys, don't do this. This is outside of what it means to be a Christian. Live this way instead. Or writing to talk to these people about different issues they're going through. I mean, Paul did the same thing in the New Testament, and we have that in the Bible. So it shouldn't have shocked me to find in the early church people talking the same way that Paul talked, because that authority didn't end, right? It continued on from Paul and the apostles to these early church fathers. So, I mean, my shock was that was the case. I thought, well, these guys sound a lot like how Paul sounds. They're writing about different issues like Paul did to correct people. So what's going on here? And I began to unpack the idea that, wait a minute, this Christian church that we see at the end of Acts, this kind of church meeting in people's houses and scattered around and hiding, that's not how the church kept going. Like, the church began to develop this hierarchy and began to organize itself. And even in those days of meeting in people's churches and people's houses, these scattered little churches, even in those days, in the New Testament, if I read that in context with the apostolic fathers, with the early church, hey, that authority that Paul was talking about and practicing, that just keeps going and actually is more easy to discern when more problems arise and as the church grows. So, I mean, the shock for me with the early church fathers was that it was so biblical. That biblical authority that began with the apostles continued. But then it also was so different from my practice of faith, right? When a pastor goes to seminary because he feels called there, which I'm sure he does, and that's a very noble thing to pursue, that calling from God, but then goes and just starts a church somewhere. And oftentimes in these days, not even within a denomination, just kind of starts a church with himself and some other leaders. They began a church and then kind of do their own thing. Like, that was not how the early church operated. And it was very clear from reading the early church fathers almost right away that there was a structure to how they were operating, and that structure just grew out of what Jesus himself, oh my goodness, began and appointed, started by appointing these disciples and Peter as the head, right? It again, I say it a lot, but it blew my mind to see this in the early church.
Yeah, so it's not only that they were emphasizing things that you wouldn't have, for example, like the succession of bishops or the real presence in the Eucharist, but you tied it into the New Testament so that there's a continuity there, moving from the pages of the New Testament to the early church period.
Yeah, because I mean, the interesting thing is when we think about how our churches were organized, the churches that I was a part of, and I was in leadership often on these churches in different capacities. My wife and I served in all kinds of ministries together. We were in leadership. We looked at the Acts of the Apostles, these scattered little churches kind of doing their own thing as an example of how to do church. So we were okay. We were fine. We were meeting in small groups. We were meeting in this one church. But
yeah, it makes perfect sense. We're chatting with the Cordial Catholic himself, K. Albert Little, and more to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. I'm Jeremy Michuta. We'll be right back.
In Luke 7, Jesus said, "I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven her, because she has been shown great love." According to St. John of the Cross, Christians should always remember that the value of their good works is not based on number and excellence. Their value is based on the love for God that prompts them to do the works. May we always be motivated by true love for God, and not worry so much about what we do, but why we do it.
We got Ernesto from Long Beach.
I just wanted to comment, and I just wanted to thank you guys. And I kind of wanted to encourage people that are listening, maybe that are not donating, because honestly, I got to be honest, I used to think you guys were a little
too over the top.
You know, yeah.
That's right.
If God gave us a lot, you know, and I have the blessing of listening to all this, and I just want to call all the people. You know, I got 5 kids, you know, and I don't make a lot of money, and I'm still donating to you guys.
God bless you, brother. You're amazing.
We have to do this. We have to do the extra. And it's not even the extra. People see it like it's extra. Kneeling for communion, saying your rosary, saying the Divine Mercy Chaplet. It is not extra. It's what the church tells us to do.
Amen. You're a good man, brother.
30 years old, 29 years old, 5 kids, and I thank you guys. But everybody else, man, get on fire. Fight for the truth, man. I know what I'm telling you guys. There's
I
no
love
God
it.
out there.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. And we're chatting with the Cordial Catholic himself, K. Albert Little, and you can check out the great podcast he does. It really is outstanding. I definitely want to talk about it at the end of this segment. It's podcast.cordialcatholic.com. And so Keith, you're looking at the early church fathers. You're finding all these interesting things that really seem very much Catholic, not evangelical. When did you start thinking about actually becoming Catholic?
Well, it was an interesting, a long kind of winding journey. I mean, I told you before, I Googled, you know, what do evangelicals read who want to become Catholic, and found a number of books, and I began to read these. I was first of all blown away that any evangelicals became Catholic. I didn't know that was even a thing that happened. Like that completely shocked me to find these people like Scott Hahn or Steve Ray, Doug Beaumont, all these people who became Catholic, who were evangelicals, who knew their Bible, were steeped in their faith, were leading their churches, leading their communities, scholars. I mean, I couldn't believe that, first of all. And so as soon as I realized that was an option, I began to think, well, maybe, maybe. And I read some more stuff. I mean, the funny thing is, and I've learned this actually from talking to Doug Beaumont on my show, is that, you know, we have to be in a place where your worldview begins to shift to even consider that. You know, I remember way back when in my journey, shortly after that pastor asked me that first question, I knew literally one Catholic, and he was the guy that lived above our apartment, where we lived, some friends and I lived. And he heard what I was thinking about. I think I may have mentioned it to him just offhand in the laundry room or something when we were doing our laundry. And he brought me a copy of Scott Hahn's Rome Sweet Home. And at the time, I wasn't anywhere to read that book. I wasn't in the place where that was something I was interested in even doing. And so I got it. It sat on my shelf for the semester, and I gave it back to him at the end before I moved out and said, thanks, I didn't have time to read this. But now, years later, once I had read kind of a bit of the early church fathers, and once I began to read a bit more about what Catholics believed from actual Catholic sources, I again found Scott Hahn's book and just devoured it, of course, and was shocked that Protestants became Catholic, was shocked by how it all made sense, how the Bible was put together this way. There's this authority framework, this thing called the Eucharist. The church has always practiced and believed it was the real body, blood, soul and divinity of Christ. Once I found these things out from this book, when I got it at the right time, right, and read it again, that's when I began to realize that all these things that I knew about how the church operated and the early church looked, these things the church practiced called the Sacraments have been practiced since the beginning of the church. We lost those at the Reformation, and I didn't even know it. I didn't even know what a sacrament was, or how the Reformation had really changed what had been the church for 1,500 years. Once I began to recognize that, and I remember critically, I read St. Francis de Sales, one of my very favorite saints. I read something he wrote to the early reformers, And now I had no idea that as the Reformation was taking place, there were Catholics who were writing responses to the Reformation, like Francis de Sales was doing. And I remember reading something that he wrote, and he posed the question to some of these reformers, who gives you the authority to break off from this church that Jesus founded and do your own thing? Like, which bishop gave you the authority to start this church? Right. And I thought, yeah, if the church was what Christ founded and continued all the way along with the sacraments, with the priesthood, with this authority passing down, and I came to a place where, this historically, from the Bible, from the evidence, from the early church, this all made sense. What authority did anybody have to break off from that and start their own thing? And here I was, 500 years later in one of these break-off churches, and I had no idea. But once I kind of realized that, I can remember very vividly, Gary, I'm up here in Canada, as I mentioned, and it was a very snowy evening, and I had cooked a pot of soup and had to cool it down before I could blend it up to add the next thing in. And so I had this pot of soup out in the snowbank behind our house, and I'm on the deck just looking at this soup as it cools in the snow, cooling down so I can blend it. And I thought, where can I go? I know too much to not become Catholic at this point. What other options do I have? Kind of like, I don't want to compare myself to the apostles, but kind of like, St. Peter's like, where else can I go, Lord? I mean, I thought, what can I do but become Catholic? Yeah. And, I remember I number of experiences that informed me going from that. I met with our pastor and kind of asked him, here's where I'm at. What do you think? And I met with the guy who originally asked me that question, who has now moved on to a different church, and he kind of had no response. And I was hoping that somebody would talk me out of becoming Catholic. But as I asked these questions, and again, this goes back to what Dr. Doug Beaumont has really informed my thinking on this. He's a guru in my books on this idea of these worldview shifts and these mindset shifts. Well, these people that I was talking to, who I thought would have an answer to talk me out of becoming Catholic, these weren't questions that they had even considered many times. Like me in my evangelical worldview, I hadn't thought about apostolic succession or what the early church really looked like, or the sacraments, or what happened at the Reformation. I hadn't considered these things in any great length, and neither had these people that I was talking to. I mean, granted, the one pastor asked me that one question about tradition in the Bible. That's kind of where it ended for him. He didn't go any further than asking those questions, even though I went much further than he did. Yeah. So nobody could talk me out of it, Gary. To be honest, there were no good answers. Once I learned what the church looked like and the sacraments and the authority that was passed down, these things made sense, and there was nobody to say otherwise. I've learned now since. I mean, as your Catholic listeners will know, that there really aren't good answers to why it's okay to break away from this church and start your own thing, when for the longest time, the majority of Catholic, or the majority of Christian history, I should say, the church was this very Catholic, apostolic church that continues on. I had no good reasons left to remain protesting against that, right?
Right. Yeah, where was your wife in all this? Was she kind of studying along with you, or were you off on your own?
Gary, like again, the archetype of the Catholic convert, like many Catholic converts before me and many, after me. I'm talking to one friend right now over email who's where I was. I didn't do a good job of keeping anybody informed. Yeah. I talked to Matt Swaim, who I know you've talked to a number of times on your program about this idea, and he said something to the effect of, we don't know what others are, because I asked him about praying for our non-Catholic friends and family, and he said, well, think about your own conversion. Were you keeping people up to date with your conversion as you were going along? And now I had a blog, so in a sense I was the Cordial Catholic. I was writing about this as I went along, but my immediate friends and family who didn't read that blog, they were the smart ones. They'd have no idea what was going on, really. And my wife and I were very much together in our ministry as evangelicals. We were part of leadership at our church, but I didn't I didn't do a very good job of keeping her informed of what I was thinking and processing. Before we had kids, I'd be up till 2 or 3 in the morning on YouTube watching Journey Home videos, watching apologetic videos, listening to lectures, just devouring Catholic literature, books upon books upon books. Once she'd gone to bed, I'd have free time to do all these things, right? But I didn't, like so many converts, I didn't do a good job of keeping her in the loop. Now, a year later, she followed me into the church, largely in part, I think, to the intercession of our Blessed Mother, largely to the intercession or the physical, real life intercession of Catholics that we would meet. Because one of these things, again, and Matt and I talked about this when I had him on my program, it's the hardest people, Gary, to evangelize are often your closest friends and family, right? Because they know you so well, they know. So other people were often the ones who helped that to happen, whether they were alive in heaven or alive on earth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, praise God for that. And that's a great segue. I wanted to talk a little bit about your podcast ministry. So apparently you were the Cordial Catholic before you became Catholic?
I began blogging in about 2014, and just to process my own journey. For the most part, I didn't have a lot of people to talk to about this, not a lot of friends who were super interested in my bizarre Catholic journey. So I began writing about it, and pretty quickly I was blessed by Elizabeth Scalia, who's now at the Word on Fire Institute with Bishop Barron. She was the editor at Pathos at the time when I was blogging, and she looped me into that, brought me on board there. And I blogged for a number of years since 2014 up until about a year and a half ago, and I still do write. But I thought, this podcast medium is, everyone's starting a podcast. I want to try it out. And so I began that. I put some emails out to some Catholic apologetics friends who I knew and people I didn't quite know very well. And the ball got rolling pretty quickly. Thanks be to God. I've had a chance to sit down with so many people to talk about all kinds of aspects of the Catholic faith, just from my perspective. So a lot of converts come and find the show and kind of learn about these aspects of the church that drew me in. A lot of new Catholics and a lot of Catholics who want to dig deeper into these topics that, here's a place to do it. So it's been going for a little over a year now. It's been this incredible endeavor. I don't know who's listening or why, but people seem to like it and listen. And it's been an absolute joy and a blessing. I know I love these conversations, and bringing these conversations to a wider audience has been, I don't want to say mind-blowing again, Gary. I have a bigger vocabulary than that, but it's been an amazing experience to be a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do a great job. I mean, you're a wonderful host, great guest, and the nice thing too is that since you're a convert, you can see things from both points of view. So you know what people might be asking if they're not Catholic, and be able to work that in the conversation.
Yeah, I really try and keep that perspective because, and one of the things I've learned, and this is something that lots of converts say, is you forget what it's like to have that experience of conversion. You forget what you didn't used to know. Right. So this for me keeps me on my toes, keeps me reminded of my own journey and some of the things that I take for granted now, but somebody as a non-Catholic listener wouldn't even understand. I have coming up in the program, I have a bishop talking about apostolic succession. He said, well, I practice, I live this. So, have me on your show and we'll talk about it. But these things are, it's yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. Now, where can people go to listen to your podcast?
Yeah, it's The Cordial Catholic. It's available everywhere. TheCordialCatholic.com is the website, or podcast.thecordialcatholic.com. But it's everywhere. The Cordial Catholic. They'll find it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Gary. I love your program. Great talking to you. Thank you so much. God bless.
CordialCatholic.com, folks. Check it out. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk comes at you with Terry and Jessica. Thank you so much for listening, and God willing, we'll speak again tomorrow. Bye-bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.